Adrian Moretti kissed his secretary before he even decided to do it. 1 second his hands were empty. The next, his fingers were curled gently behind Natalie's head, her lips were against his, and the folders she'd been holding were falling to the floor in a soft avalanche of paper. Natalie's whole body went rigid with shock. Her brain, usually quick with a nervous joke or an apology, produced absolutely nothing. She simply stood there, eyes wide open, kissing her boss in the middle of his office, with no idea in the world why this was happening. Behind them, in the doorway, Victor Moretti watched his son with sharp, delighted eyes. Adrian pulled back just far enough to speak, his hand still resting warm at the back of Natalie's neck, his voice steady even though his heart was slamming against his ribs harder than it ever had during any business deal. "Papa," he said. "This is Natalie. My girlfriend." For one terrible heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Victor's eyebrows lifted and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the kind Adrian hadn't seen there in years. "Well," Victor said. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Natalie made a small strangled sound that wasn't quite a word. To understand how Adrian Moretti, feared boss of one of the most powerful families in the city, ended up kissing his clumsy secretary in front of his own father, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the night his father first gave him an ultimatum. "You need a wife, Adrian," Victor had said, sitting behind his enormous desk at the family estate, a glass of red wine untouched in front of him. "Someone to build a future with. A family. An heir." "I have an heir," Adrian had said. "The company runs fine without a wedding ring attached to it." "The company is not the family," Victor said. "You are 36 years old. You have built an empire, and you go home every night to an empty apartment and a refrigerator full of takeout containers. I will not watch you become me." Adrian had laughed it off then, certain his father would forget, the way fathers sometimes forgot the things they said in anger. "You have until the end of the year," Victor had said, not laughing at all. "Find someone. Settle down. Or I hand the empire to your brother, and you can live exactly the lonely life you seem so determined to choose." Adrian had not taken it seriously. Victor Moretti said many things when he wanted to make a point. But Victor Moretti never forgot anything. Which was how, 3 weeks later, with no girlfriend, no fiancé, and absolutely no plan, Adrian looked up from his desk to see his father walking through his office door completely unannounced, eyes already scanning the room for proof that his son had listened. There had been no time to think. Only Natalie, standing by the filing cabinet with a stack of folders pressed against her chest, and the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears, and 3 long steps across the office before his brain had caught up with what his body had already decided to do. Now, standing in the wreckage of that decision, Adrian kept his hand steady at the back of Natalie's neck and hoped, desperately, that she would find some way to play along. "It's lovely to finally meet you, Natalie," Victor said, stepping closer, studying her the way he studied everyone, like a book written in a language only he understood. "Likewise," Natalie squeaked. Then, because her brain was still somewhere on the floor with the scattered papers, she bent down to gather them up and smacked her head directly into the corner of Adrian's desk. "Ow." Adrian winced. Victor chuckled low and warm. "She's clumsy," Adrian said, kneeling to help her, his voice caught somewhere between annoyance and something softer he didn't want to name. "But sweet." "I can see that," Victor said, and something thoughtful crossed his eyes, something Adrian did not like at all. "You know, Adrian, I was starting to think you would never bring anyone home." "I was waiting for the right moment," Adrian said. Natalie, still holding her forehead with one hand, looked up at him with an expression that clearly said, "What moment? We have never even had a conversation that wasn't about your schedule." Adrian gave her the smallest shake of his head. "Please," his eyes begged. "Just play along." She swallowed hard and nodded once. "Good," Victor said, clapping his hands together like a man who had just closed the best deal of his life. Then it settled. "I'll start planning." "Planning what?" Adrian asked, though some cold, sinking part of him already knew. Victor's smile widened. "Your wedding, of course." The room went completely silent. Natalie's mouth fell open. Adrian felt the floor tilt under him. "Papa," he said carefully, "don't you think that's a little fast?" "Fast." Victor laughed, walking toward the door, already pulling out his phone. "Adrian, I am 68 years old. I do not have time to be slow." The door closed behind him. Adrian and Natalie stood alone in the office, surrounded by scattered papers, staring at each other in complete, horrified silence. "You," Natalie finally whispered, "kissed me." "I know." "And now your father thinks we're getting married." "I know." She pressed both hands over her face and groaned into her palms. "I need this job," she said. I have rent. I have a cat. I cannot marry my boss to keep my job. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way he did with every crisis that threatened the empire. But this crisis had a face and warm brown eyes, and a habit of tripping over carpet tiles, and for reasons he did not have time to examine, the thought of untangling himself from her did not feel as simple as it should have. Just give me until the end of the day, he said. I'll fix it. Natalie looked at him like she did not believe him even a little bit. She was right not to. Because by the end of the day nothing was fixed at all. Victor had already called 3 wedding planners, 2 priests and Adrian's mother, who was crying happy tears on the phone and asking when she could meet the woman who had finally softened her son's heart. There was no going back now. By the next morning Adrian had a plan. It was not a good plan. It was the kind of plan a desperate man makes at 2 in the morning, staring at his ceiling, listening to his own heartbeat. But it was a plan. We pretend for a few weeks, he told Natalie, pacing behind his desk while she sat stiffly in the chair across from him, arms crossed like she was bracing for bad news. My father loses interest in things quickly. Once the excitement dies down, we tell him it didn't work out. Quiet breakup. No wedding. No scandal. And in the meantime? In the meantime we act like a couple. Dinners. A few public appearances. Nothing complicated. Natalie let out a long breath through her nose. Nothing complicated, she repeated, like the words tasted strange in her mouth. You do remember I once called you Mr. Moretti in a meeting and then accidentally called you sweetheart in front of the entire board because I was reading from the wrong note card. Adrian's jaw tightened at the memory. That had in fact been a very long meeting. We will rehearse, he said. Rehearse what? Details. Our story. How we met. Our first date. Things a real couple would know about each other. And so, for the first time since she had started working for him 2 years earlier, Adrian Moretti sat across from his secretary, his fake girlfriend apparently, and asked her real questions. Favorite color? Yellow, Natalie said. Like sunflowers. Sunflowers, Adrian repeated flatly, writing it down like it was a business memo. Birthday? March the 14th. Allergies? Shellfish. And your cousin Enzo apparently, though that one's not medical. Adrian almost smiled. Almost. They rehearsed for 2 hours. By the end, Natalie could recite Adrian's coffee order, his mother's name, and the fact that he hated surprises, which Adrian found deeply ironic considering the current situation. Adrian in turn learned that Natalie had a cat named Biscuit, that she'd grown up 3 towns over from the Moretti estate, and that she'd once dropped an entire wedding cake at her cousin's reception, which explained a great deal about her general relationship with gravity. The first test came 2 days later at a family dinner. Victor had insisted. Nothing large, he said. Just close family. Which, for the Morettis, meant 22 people, 3 long tables, and enough food to feed a small army. Natalie arrived in a green dress she had borrowed from her roommate, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her purse getting out of the car. Breathe, Adrian said quietly, offering his arm. I am breathing. You're holding your breath. She let it out in one loud gust, right as they walked through the front door, directly into the path of Adrian's grandmother, who looked at Natalie like she was inspecting a rare painting. So, the old woman said. This is the girl. This is Natalie, Adrian said. Hello, Natalie said, and then because her nerves had apparently decided this was the perfect moment to betray her completely, she stuck out her hand for a handshake at the exact second Adrian's grandmother leaned in for a kiss on the cheek. Their hands and faces collided in an awkward tangle that ended with Natalie accidentally poking the old woman in the eye. The table went silent. Adrian's grandmother blinked, then burst out laughing so hard she had to sit down. Adrian, she wheezed, wiping her eyes, she is perfect for you. You are far too serious. This one will keep you human. Dinner, against all odds, went well after that. Natalie made Adrian's youngest cousins laugh with stories about the world's clumsiest cat, charmed his mother by asking real questions about her garden, and even survived a pointed round of questioning from Victor about the future without giving anything away, mostly because Adrian kept smoothly redirecting every question before she could answer it wrong. Under the table at one point, when Victor asked how they'd met, Natalie panicked and grabbed Adrian's hand for support. He didn't pull away. He told himself it was only for the act. Later that night, driving her home, the car was quiet in a way that didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. You did well tonight, Adrian said. I poked your grandmother in the eye. She loved it. Natalie laughed, surprised, and the sound of it filled the car in a way that made Adrian's hands tighten slightly on the steering wheel. "This might actually work," she said. "It has to," he said. "For a few weeks. Then it's over." "Right?" Natalie said, looking out the window at the passing lights. "A few weeks." Neither of them noticed how quiet the car went after that. They did not know yet that Victor, sitting alone in his study that same night, was smiling to himself, watching the two of them drive away through the window, already certain of something they hadn't figured out at all. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this to life. Now back to the story. Adrian's plan to let his father lose interest failed completely, and it failed fast. Within a week, Victor had booked a venue. Within 2 weeks, he had chosen flowers. By the time Adrian realized what was happening, his mother was already crying over fabric samples for table linens, and his father was walking around the estate humming, actually humming, a sound Adrian had not heard from him since before Adrian's own mother had first said yes to marrying him. "Papa, this is too fast," Adrian said, standing in Victor's study, watching him flip through a folder labeled wedding, Adrian and Natalie, like it was a business acquisition. "Fast." Victor didn't even look up. "Your grandfather married your grandmother 3 weeks after meeting her. Some things you simply know. We haven't even set a date." "I have." Victor finally looked up, smiling the way he smiled right before he closed a deal he'd already decided was finished. 6 weeks from Saturday. Adrian felt the air leave his lungs. He found Natalie in the office the next morning, staring at her phone with the particular stillness of a woman who has just seen something she cannot believe. "Adrian," she said, turning the screen toward him. "Your mother added me to a wedding planning group chat. There are 43 messages. About flowers. I don't know anything about flowers." "Neither do I. There's a countdown. It says 41 days. Adrian sat down heavily across from her. For the first time since this whole mess began, he had no clever solution ready. "We could tell him the truth," Natalie said quietly. Adrian shook his head. "If I tell him now, after everything, he won't just be disappointed. He'll see it as proof I can't be trusted to run anything. The company. The family. All of it goes to my brother. So we just get married? We call it off after," Adrian said. Quietly. "In a few months. People change their minds. It happens." Natalie stared at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that Adrian couldn't quite read. Then she sighed and nodded, because what other choice did either of them have? The 6 weeks that followed were the strangest of Adrian's life. There were dress fittings, where Natalie tripped over the hem of 3 different gowns and knocked over a rack of veils, and somehow still ended up looking in the 4th dress so beautiful that Adrian forgot for one full moment that any of this was pretend. There were dance lessons, where Natalie stepped on his feet so many times he started wearing his sturdiest shoes on purpose, and where, halfway through the 5th lesson, she finally stopped counting steps out loud and simply let him lead, her hand warm in his, her laughter soft against his shoulder when they spun too fast and nearly crashed into the instructor. There were quiet nights at his apartment, going over guest lists and seating charts, where somewhere between the appetizer course and the cake flavors, they stopped talking about the wedding entirely and just talked. About her mother, who had passed when Natalie was 19. About his brother, who had never forgiven him for being born first. About small, real things that had nothing to do with the empire or the lie they were both living inside. Adrian began to notice things he had never noticed before. The way Natalie hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. The way she always gave the office building's stray cat half of her lunch. The way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking back. He told himself none of it meant anything. He was lying to himself just as much as he was lying to his father. The morning of the wedding, Natalie stood at the back of the church, her hands trembling inside long white sleeves, staring down the aisle at the crowd of people who had come to celebrate a marriage that wasn't real. "You can still run," her roommate whispered beside her, half joking, half not. Natalie almost laughed. Almost. Instead, the music started, and her feet carried her forward on their own, past rows of Adrian's family, past Victor beaming in the front row like a man who had just won everything he'd ever wanted, until she stood face to face with Adrian at the altar. He looked at her like he had never truly seen her before. The officiant began to speak, his voice steady and warm, moving through the words that had been spoken at 1,000 weddings before this one. Adrian said his vows clearly, calmly, his eyes never leaving hers. Then it was Natalie's turn. "Do you take this man," the officiant asked, "to be your husband?" Natalie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She stood frozen, staring into Adrian's eyes, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire church could hear it, and for one long, terrifying moment, she completely forgot she was supposed to say anything at all. The silence stretched on so long that Adrian's mother, sitting in the second row, began fanning herself nervously with the wedding program. Adrian leaned in close, just enough for only Natalie to hear. "Say yes," he whispered. "Please." Natalie blinked like she was waking up from a dream, and the words tumbled out of her in a rush, too loud, too fast. "I do. I do." The church erupted into laughter, warm and delighted, and even Adrian, who had spent the last 6 weeks braced for disaster after disaster, found himself laughing too, a real laugh, the kind he almost never let himself have in public. The officiant, chuckling, pronounced them husband and wife. When Adrian kissed her this time, in front of everyone who mattered to his family, it did not feel like the panicked kiss from that first day in his office. It felt slower, steadier, like something he meant. Natalie told herself it didn't mean anything. She was getting very good at telling herself things that weren't true. The reception passed in a blur of toasts and dancing, and by the time the last guests left, Natalie's feet ached from her shoes, her cheeks hurt from smiling, and something in her chest felt strange and full in a way she didn't have a name for. Married life, it turned out, was more complicated than pretending to date. They moved into Adrian's apartment together because appearances mattered, Victor said, and a married couple living apart would raise questions. Natalie brought over 3 boxes of clothes, a small collection of paperback novels, and Biscuit, who took one look at Adrian's spotless white furniture and immediately claimed the most expensive armchair as her own. Adrian, to his own great surprise, did not mind. He came home from long, difficult days running the empire to find Natalie curled up on the couch with the cat, laughing at something on her phone, and something in his chest loosened every single time, like a fist slowly unclenching after years of being closed. She left sticky notes on his mirror with little reminders and terrible jokes. She learned, without being asked, exactly how he took his coffee, and started making it for him every morning before he even asked. She still tripped over things constantly, still knocked over the occasional lamp, still forgot small details about their supposed love story when his relatives asked too many questions, but Adrian found he no longer minded rescuing her from those moments. He found, in fact, that he looked forward to it. Their first real fight came a month into the marriage over something small that grew into something larger, the way small things often do. Natalie had made plans with an old friend from college, a man named Filippo, without mentioning it to Adrian first. When Adrian found out, something ugly and unfamiliar twisted in his chest, something he did not recognize until much later as jealousy. "You could have told me," he said, his voice colder than he meant it to be. "Told you what?" Natalie shot back, arms crossed. "That I was having coffee with a friend? Adrian, we're not actually married." "Not really. I don't have to report my schedule to you." The words landed harder than she expected them to. She saw it in his face, a flicker of something that looked almost like hurt, quickly hidden behind his usual calm. "You're right," he said quietly. "I apologize." He left the room before she could say anything else, and Natalie stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the space where he'd been standing, wondering why her chest suddenly ached so badly over a fight about nothing. They didn't speak much that evening. Adrian worked late in his study. Natalie sat with Biscuit on the couch, staring at the same page of her book for nearly an hour without reading a single word. It was well past midnight when Adrian finally came to find her. "I don't like the idea of you with someone else," he admitted, standing in the doorway, his voice quieter and more honest than she had ever heard it. "Even if none of this is supposed to be real." Natalie's heart climbed into her throat. "Adrian? I know it's not part of the plan," he continued before she could stop him. "I know we agreed this ends quietly in a few months and everyone moves on. But I keep forgetting that's the plan. I keep forgetting this isn't real." Natalie stood up slowly, closing the distance between them. "Maybe," she said softly, "we should stop calling it pretend." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something. Then, for the first time since that very first panicked kiss in his office, Natalie closed the distance between them herself. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, gently, with no father watching, no audience to convince, no lie to protect. This time there was no reason for it at all, except that she wanted to. Adrian kissed her back like he had been waiting for this exact moment for far longer than either of them had realized. Outside the apartment, the city lights blinked on below them, indifferent to the two people finally admitting, in the quiet dark of their kitchen, that somewhere between the fake dates and the fake wedding, they had fallen in love for real. Neither of them knew yet that Victor Moretti had known the truth about their arrangement from almost the very beginning. The weeks that followed were, quietly, the happiest of Adrian's life. He had spent so many years believing that love was a weakness, a door left open for enemies to walk through, that he had never allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to simply be happy with another person. Now he knew. It felt like coming home to a warm kitchen instead of an empty apartment. It felt like Natalie's laugh drifting down the hallway. It felt like her cold feet finding his under the blankets every single night, and him no longer minding at all. He started leaving the office earlier, something his assistant noted with visible shock. He started smiling in meetings, which unsettled several of his business partners considerably. His brother, watching from the edges of the family the way he always did, grew quieter and more resentful, certain that Adrian's newfound happiness was simply one more thing keeping the empire out of his own hands. Natalie, for her part, had stopped counting the days until the marriage was supposed to end. She had stopped thinking of the ring on her finger as a costume piece and started thinking of it as simply hers. Then one afternoon everything changed. She had gone to the estate to drop off papers for Adrian, who was stuck in back-to-back meetings, and found Victor alone in his study, sorting through an old wooden box of photographs. "Natalie," he said warmly, waving her inside. "Come, sit with an old man for a moment." She sat, glancing at the photographs spread across his desk. Adrian as a boy, missing his front teeth, grinning at the camera. Adrian's mother, younger, laughing on a beach somewhere. "You've been good for him," Victor said, not looking up. "I haven't seen my son smile like this in 15 years. "He's been good for me too," Natalie said honestly. Victor was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that made Natalie's blood run cold. "I knew, you know. From the very beginning." Natalie's hands went still in her lap. "Knew what?" "That you weren't really together. That day in his office when he kissed you." Victor finally looked up, his expression not angry but strangely gentle. "I've built an empire out of reading people, Natalie. I know a lie when I see one. I simply chose not to say anything." The room seemed to tilt. You knew? This whole time?" "I suspected, and then a very thorough investigation of my own confirmed it," Victor said simply. "I needed to know who you were before I let my son marry you, real or pretend. What I found was a woman who was honest and kind, and brave enough to stand her ground with a man everyone else in this city is afraid of." Natalie stood up, her chest suddenly tight. "So the ultimatum, the wedding, all of it, it was never really about finding Adrian a wife." "No," Victor admitted. "It was about finding out whether my son could still learn to trust someone, whether he could love without needing to control everything around him. I was afraid he was becoming exactly like me, and I did not want that life for him. Lonely, suspicious, never fully certain if anyone truly cared for him, or only for what he could give them. And you let us go through all of it," Natalie said, her voice shaking now. "The dinners, the rehearsals, the entire wedding, knowing it started as a lie, and you said nothing?" "I gave you both the room to find something real," Victor said. "And from what I've seen these past months, I believe you did." But Natalie was no longer listening closely. All she could hear, over and over, was the fact that Victor had known. That every dinner, every family gathering, every moment she had believed she and Adrian were fooling him, he had simply been watching, testing, waiting. And Adrian? Had Adrian known too? Had any part of what happened between them, the real kiss in the kitchen, the nights curled together on the couch, been built on the same lie Victor had been quietly allowing all along? She left the estate without saying goodbye, her hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire drive home. When Adrian returned that evening, tired but smiling, calling her name as he walked through the door, he found her sitting on the couch in the dark, biscuit curled silently in her lap, her face pale and unreadable. "Natalie?" He crossed the room quickly, kneeling in front of her. "What happened? Are you all right?" "Did you know," she asked quietly, "that your father knew our relationship was fake from the very beginning?" Adrian went very still. And in the silence that followed, Natalie realized with a sinking heart that she already had her answer. "I found out 3 weeks after the wedding," Adrian said quietly. "He came to me privately. He told me he'd known from the start and that he wasn't angry. That he only wanted to see if I could love someone honestly, without controlling every part of it." 3 weeks, Natalie repeated, her voice flat. "And you didn't tell me. I didn't know how." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, something he only did when he was truly lost, a habit Natalie had learned to recognize over the past months. "By then, things between us had already changed. I was afraid that if I told you my father knew, you'd think everything we'd built since then was somehow less real. That it was still just part of his plan. Wasn't it?" Natalie's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. He orchestrated the whole thing, Adrian. The ultimatum, the deadline, all of it just to see if you would fall in love. We were an experiment. A test he ran on his own son. Maybe he did, Adrian said, but nothing he did made me kiss you first that day in the office. He didn't make me look for you when you weren't around, or worry about you when you had coffee with an old friend, or fall in love with the way you hum when you think no one's listening. That was all real, Natalie. Every bit of it was mine, not his. Natalie shook her head, standing up, putting distance between them because she needed to think, and she could not think clearly with him this close. I don't even know what's real anymore, she said. I don't know if I fell in love with you, or if I fell in love with an idea your father built for both of us to walk into. Then let me prove it to you, Adrian said, standing too, his voice steady even though his hands, Natalie noticed, were not. Not with words. With something real. He left the apartment that night and did not come back until very late. Natalie barely slept. She sat curled on the couch with Biscuit, replaying every moment of the past months, searching for the line between what had been performance and what had been true, and finding, to her own frustration, that she could no longer separate the two at all. Perhaps that was the answer in itself. Perhaps a lie that changes so completely into something else stops being a lie somewhere along the way. In the morning she found Adrian in his study, surrounded by papers, looking like he hadn't slept at all. What is this? She asked, picking up one of the documents. Transfer papers, he said. I called an emergency meeting with the family lawyers last night. I'm signing over my position in the company's public operations. My brother can have the empire, if that's what my father truly wants passed down. I'm keeping only what's mine outright, the parts that were never tied to any of it. Natalie stared at him. Adrian, that's everything you've built your whole life. No, he said, standing, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step away if she wanted to. You are what I want to build the rest of my life around. Not the empire. Not my father's plans. If I have to prove that by walking away from everything else, then that's what I'll do. You don't have to give up everything for me, Natalie whispered. I'm not giving it up for you, Adrian said. I'm giving it up for us. There's a difference, and it took me 36 years and one very clumsy secretary to finally understand it. Natalie let out a small, watery laugh despite herself. I poked your grandmother in the eye, she reminded him. And she loved you for it, Adrian said, reaching up to gently wipe a tear from her cheek. Everyone in that family loved you before they even had a reason to. I think some part of me did too, longer than I want to admit. Natalie looked down at the transfer papers in his hands, at the man standing in front of her who had just offered to walk away from everything he'd spent his entire life building, and felt something inside her chest finally settle. Don't sign those yet, she said softly. Adrian frowned. Why not? Because I believe you, she said. And because I don't think either of us should let your father's test decide what happens next. This is our choice now. Not his. Relief broke across Adrian's face like sunlight through clouds. He reached for her hand, and this time, when their fingers laced together, there was no audience to convince, no father to fool, and no lie left standing between them at all. Somewhere across the city, Victor Moretti sat alone in his study, staring at his phone, waiting anxiously for his son to call. The call came the next morning. Papa, Adrian said, standing on the balcony of the apartment, watching the sun rise over the city while Natalie made coffee inside, humming quietly to herself the way she always did. I need you to understand something. I'm listening, Victor said, and for the first time in Adrian's memory, his father's voice carried a note of real uncertainty. I'm not giving up the company, Adrian said. But I'm not running it your way anymore either. No more tests. No more ultimatums. If you want to see me build something real, then you let me build it without deciding in secret whether I've passed or failed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. That's fair, Victor finally said, and Adrian could hear, underneath the words, something that sounded almost like pride. I only wanted to see you happy, Adrian. I was afraid I'd raised you to be as guarded and alone as I made myself, all those years after your mother and I struggled. I didn't know another way to break through to you except to force your hand. You could have just asked me to trust someone, Adrian said, instead of scaring me into pretending to. Perhaps, Victor admitted. But look how it turned out. Adrian glanced through the glass door at Natalie, who caught his eye and smiled, holding up 2 mugs of coffee, one of them already exactly the way he liked it. Yeah, Adrian said softly. Look how it turned out. They talked a while longer, father and son, in a way they hadn't in years, honest in a manner neither of them was fully used to. By the end of the call, something between them had shifted, Not fixed completely, not overnight, but shifted enough that Adrian felt, for the first time, like his father saw him as a man and not simply an heir to manage. 6 months later, the Moretti family gathered again, this time for a celebration that needed no lies to hold it together. It wasn't a second wedding exactly. Adrian and Natalie were already married after all, however strangely it had begun. It was, instead, a party Victor insisted on throwing, a chance, he said, to celebrate a marriage that had somehow become the realest thing in the entire family. Natalie wore yellow, her favorite color, a soft, sunlit dress that made Adrian's chest ache every time he looked at her. Adrian's grandmother held court near the dessert table, telling anyone who would listen the story of the day Natalie had poked her in the eye, laughing harder each time she told it. Adrian's brother came too, quieter than usual, but present, and when he raised his glass for the toast, his words, though brief, were sincere. To Adrian, he said, who I always thought was too cold to ever really fall for anyone. And to Natalie for proving me wrong. Laughter rippled through the garden. Later that evening, when the party had thinned and the string lights above the garden glowed soft gold against the darkening sky, Adrian found Natalie standing near the edge of the terrace, looking out over the grounds where, 6 months ago, they had first pretended to be something they weren't. Any regrets? He asked, coming up beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. Natalie leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. About marrying my terrifying, powerful Mafia boss husband after one panicked kiss and an engineered ultimatum from his father? She smiled up at him. Not one. Even the part where you had to learn my coffee order, my mother's name, and my ridiculous cousin Enzo's entire life story in one afternoon? Especially that part, she said. It's how I fell for you. Slowly and then all at once, somewhere between the fake dates and the real ones. Adrian tipped her chin up gently and kissed her, unhurried, certain, with the whole warm evening stretched out around them and no one left to convince. What had begun as a lie told in a moment of panic had become, without either of them fully realizing when the shift happened, the truest thing in both their lives. Adrian Moretti, feared by half the city, controlled by no one, had finally let one clumsy, kind-hearted woman walk straight through every wall he'd ever built. And somewhere in the garden, Victor Moretti watched his son laugh freely under the string lights, and allowed himself, quietly, the satisfaction of an old man who had gambled everything on love and won. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If it made you smile or feel something warm along the way, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting us know what you loved most. Your support means the world and helps us keep bringing you heartfelt stories like this one. We'll see you in the next story filled with more love, more laughter, and more happy endings.